Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Patricia Paddey, and I'm here with Karen Stiller. Together, we co-authored Craft, Cost, and Call. And we thought we'd like to let you in on our Zoom conversation with one of our favorite podcasters, Chase Replogle. Welcome, Chase.
Thanks. It's a privilege to be with you and a joy to be talking about writing.
Oh, wonderful. We can't wait to get started. Just by way of giving Chase a little bit of an introduction, he is a writer and pastor of Bent Oak Church in Springfield, Missouri. And he hosts the Pastor Writer podcast. Karen and I are longtime fans of his show. On the Pastor Writer, he interviews pastors and authors on the calling and craft of writing. And he's featured writers like Max Lucado, Philip Yancey, Oz Guinness, and Karen Swallow Pryor. His writings have appeared in Christianity Today and other places, and he has a degree in biblical studies and an MA in New Testament. In his free time, Chase enjoys being outdoors with his wife and 2 kids and their dog, Millie. And as I said, Karen and I have been really looking forward to this interview because we've both listened to your podcast from its beginning. And that's where we'd like to begin. So we've prepared a few questions. And Karen, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, Chase, thank you again so much. We want to start with the fact of the podcast because I think you've been pretty transparent throughout the podcast that the actual podcast has been part of your kind of platform building and your journey as a writer and as a Christian writer specifically. So tell us about where the podcast came from and how you literally started it and built it to where it is today.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. As most writers will know, one of the first questions that comes up in any conversation is that platform question. And early on in writing, I started working on a manuscript for a book, which is kind of out of order. Normally you would do a proposal and find an agent, but I sort of needed to prove to myself I could do this thing before I took the leap into it. And so I had started writing and working on a manuscript and spent about a year working on that. And through that process, working with a writing coach, the conversation about, hey, at some point you've got to start working on platform if this is, you're going to do something with this manuscript. And to be honest with you, I really struggled with what that looked like for me. You mentioned I'm a pastor. I'm actually a small church pastor. Our church is about 75 people. I really love that relational part of ministry. Up until starting the podcast, number one, with the last name like Replogle, I don't have an easy name for building some big brand, ChaseReplogle.com. I just really hadn't done very much publicly. I had been writing a lot privately and a lot that I hadn't even published. I was putting a lot of time and effort into the writing of my sermons and just trying to grow in craft. But I knew it was something I needed to do. But I wanted to find my way into it. And I often tell people there's so much pressure to do everything. You have to have a great Instagram account. You've got to have a great website. You've got to be blogging. You've got to be guest blogging. You've got to have a podcast. You've got to have a YouTube channel. I tell people to find the thing that feels most natural for you to start with. And for me, it's stuff like this, conversations. I love having good conversations. It felt very natural for me to do that. And so the podcast was a great fit. Early on, calling it the Pastor Writer podcast, I really focused on what it meant and looked like for me to sort of combine these two vocations of being a pastor and a writer. And a lot of the content was specifically about writing and how it relates to ministry. But over the last couple of years, that podcast, as you probably know, has kind of evolved to I'm a pastor writer, and these are interesting conversations I'm having with people that I would like to talk about the books they've written. And so I think there's some flexibility, but to get started, find that thing that's most natural for you. And then, of course, things have come along. I do more on Instagram. I'm toying with doing some more on YouTube. Those things can come, but getting that sort of foundational piece that's most natural has been really helpful for me finding my way into that platform question. And I always sort of say it's been a little bit selfish. I've just gotten to have really good conversations that without a podcast, I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to have. So there's just been a joy in doing it for its own sake as well.
Chase, we'd love to know how you literally got started on the podcast. Mm-hmm. Like, where did you begin? From the first episode, it was so well done. I mean, just in terms of technical quality, you had original music created, your graphics that fit with it on the website. How did you know what kind of microphone to buy? All of those things.
Yeah, well, some of that's me stumbling my way into it. I have a little bit of a background in digital strategy. So, in addition to pastoring, I actually do freelance web design and development. That's something I've mentioned just a few times on the podcast. But honestly, probably 75% of my income comes from that freelance work. And I've thought about that work as sort of the thing that's funded and allowed me to do these other things like writing. So, it's common for me to carve out a day to work on the podcast, which means I'm working really hard those other days to sort of fund that free day. So I've not tried to rely on the writing or the podcast to create the income. I've tried to find ways to fund it. And so I brought a little bit of that. I knew enough to know what a podcast was. I'm pretty proficient in Photoshop for graphics. The audio stuff has been sort of me pestering friends that have a background in it and saying, okay, here's my budget. What mic would I buy? About a year into the project, I upgraded to a nicer mic. So a lot of it's, just getting started, and knowing what you sort of over-index in. So for me, I knew I could put together a website for it. So that was important early on. That's what I do. And I knew I wanted to have some just really honest and sort of unique conversations from the beginning. And so, you joke about the audio quality being good. This is like a professional mic I'm talking on now. I had like $100 mic and it didn't sound great. So I had a cardboard box that I lined with like foam I bought on Amazon. So I would literally do these calls with my head sort of in this cardboard box, trying to get it to sound good. So you do whatever you have to do. You find a way to sort of to take that next step and then jump in and do it.
Good for you. Good for
So
you.
you've interviewed so many people, Chase. Do you have a favorite interview or episode you can share with us?
I have loved, I tell you what, there's been a few recently that have been really great. I love the conversations with Karen Swallow Prior. I've had a couple of those, and she writes particularly on classic literature. She's an English professor, but brings to it a Christian perspective. I've always found those helpful because those conversations that leave you wanting to go and read something new or exposes you to something new are really, really interesting to me. I just this last week released an episode on poetry, which is a topic I've wanted to cover for a long time. We actually did some poetry readings. I loved that conversation because, again, it exposed me to things that I'm not sure I would have come across on my own. So that to me, the sort of the great episodes are the ones where you walk away saying, all right, I've got to immediately go add that to my Amazon wish list, or I've got to immediately go pull something off the shelf I haven't read. Those have been a couple of my favorites.
And one of your early monologues, you talked about your experience of wanting to be a great writer and said how that can actually get in the way of writing. So how have you made sense of that struggle? And at what point did you realize that that was actually an issue for you?
Yeah, well, there's that often quoted sort of writer's quote that goes, "Writers love to have written." And I think the truth is, if we're honest, a lot of what we fall in love with is the idea of writing over the actual difficult work of sitting there and writing. And it's really easy. So much of my interest in writing has been shaped by books and authors that I love. I think it's like any work of art. If you love going to the art museum, at some point, how do you not find yourself wanting to try painting? And if you love music, how at some point do you not pick up a guitar and try to teach yourself some chords? And usually you learn to appreciate more the masters because of sort of failing to be able to do what you love, right? And writing for me started that way. Books were becoming so important to me and so formative to me, and starting to recognize more the literary craft of the scriptural writers, seeing how they came to the work as literature, and then also other writers in books. It made me sort of curious to try and to see what I could do. But really quickly, you can fall in love with that idea. And there's always that early stage where you're just sort of mimicking the thing that has inspired you. And I don't think you can avoid that. I think that's part of the process, but it's something you have to move through. And moving through that, I think, has a lot to do with letting go of some of those ideas or agendas you might have had about who you wanted to be as a writer. E.B. White has a quote that I often quote where he'll say, writing is an act of faith and not a trick of grammar. And I really think it's true when it comes to your voice and who you are as a writer, that it's something you sort of have to just accept to some degree. This is who I am and where I am and how I write and the way I'm seeing things. And the more I try to do something else, the more I end up sort of just awkwardly mimicking someone that's inspired me. It's good they've inspired me, but it's got to inspire me to go and to really write from who I am and the way I'm seeing things and articulating things in this sort of faithful voice that I'm discovering in that process.
Mm.
Chase, you also, to me, you demonstrate a lot of resilience and determination and not giving up, which I think Patricia and I have both, and I'm sure you've seen this too. We've seen really gifted writers give up too soon because it was just too discouraging, or they just couldn't deal with the failure, or what felt like failure. Can you speak to that, just that resilience and how you've kept going, and you've been successful. You're reaching some goals.
Yeah, thanks. I sort of laugh at the question as well because it is so true that the irony of being, 2.5 years into a podcast on being a writer, and for 2.5 years I've been talking about this book, and people will say, "Well, where is it?" And well, it's not there yet. And the truth is, it's probably a ways away. Yeah, one of the biggest things that I've learned over the last few years from my conversations with authors, but also my own experience, is just, I mean, to put it frankly, how long and grueling this process can be. And there are shortcuts, and sometimes those are the right shortcuts for certain reasons. Sometimes there are opportunities you should jump on, and sometimes you also sense it's not the right one, and it's worth that patience and endurance. And the thing I always try to say to myself is you have to love the process. Writing is so hard and it's so long that if you're just doing it for something you've imagined at the end, landing an agent or landing a contract or holding a book with your name on it, honestly, I don't know if there's enough in that to sustain the amount of work and time that goes in. You really have to do the work itself of writing for the love of that process. And for me, it's a little bit, writing feels like a puzzle. Like there's something I enjoy about figuring out how the arguments fit together and seeing it come together and seeing a work improve. The joy of that in and of itself, I think, has to be there, or it won't see you through. There's not enough. And the truth is that milestone you have in your mind is success. When you get there, there's just another one, right? So, you land an agent and you realize how much work goes into a contract. You land a contract and you realize how much work goes into selling and making that book successful enough that there'll be a second contract. And so you really have to love the work. That's the only thing, in my opinion, that sustains you through that long process.
Outside of the resilience and the tenacity, the perseverance that you have developed over the years, you believe that writing has actually deepened your faith. Talk to us a bit about that. How so? Help us understand how you've made sense of that in your own life and heart.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. It's because I do say, as long and grueling as that process is, if it all failed, if nothing came of it, and for whatever reason the podcast fizzled out, and I was left, 4 or 5 years into this process with nothing to show for it again, I do think the work has been worth it. Like I think it's impacted me enough that it's been valuable, and there's a lot to that. There's all the little details, the little things that I've read and uncovered and learned to articulate that I've lived now because of that. Those are, little bits of that value, but there's bigger ones in that writing has forced me to pay closer attention to myself and the world. I think good writing does that. It's forced me well, the way I sometimes will say it is I think writing inevitably exposes you. So when you're faking it and trying to be something, I think that comes across on the page. When you're really authentic and you're discovering something about yourself through that process of writing, I think that comes through on the page. And so I think there's a value to writing in that it helps you deal with who you are, and it helps you think more deeply about things you hadn't considered. And in a similar way that I think all pursuits that God calls us to really be faithful to those pursuits requires a kind of self-inventorying and a sense of integrity, of wholeness, of sort of dealing with everything that's there, all that you're feeling. I think the pursuit of writing does that as well. It's forced me to recognize, what am I really after? What are some of these idols that might be lurking? What are the real joys? And are those joys enough? It's similar to pastoring. I have written before and talked about early on in pastoring when, I'd planted a church and you'd show up on some Sundays and there'd be 30 people in the room and 10 of them were relatives of yours to some degree who felt obligated to be there. And you'd worked all week on this sermon, it's Romans 1. How are there not more people here to hear this? And I would oftentimes say to myself, I'd ask this little rhetorical question and I would say to myself, okay, God, you've called me to do this. Could I be faithful to this work if this is all there is? Now I didn't think that's what would happen, but God, if you are asking me to pastor these same 30 people for the next 50, 60 years of my life, if I'm laying in a hospital bed someday looking back on what I've accomplished, would faithfulness be enough? Most of the time, the answer to that is no. I knew my heart well enough to know I wanted more. I was doing this for more. But I think the best Sundays were when that was a yes, when there was enough in faithfulness and in being with those people to say, you know what, it does feel good to just please God and do what he puts in front of me. I always felt like that's when I was the best pastor. And I think there's something true of that in writing too, that when I'm just faithful to what I'm supposed to say and I'm doing it to the best of my abilities, there's enough in that. Do I want people to read it? Absolutely. Do I want more people to read it? Absolutely. Will I do the work so that more people can read it? I will. But I want that joy of it just being enough to be faithful to the work. I hope that's one of the big lessons that's come through with writing.
We'd love to hear more of the lessons that you've gleaned from the podcast. I mean, you're interviewing masters of the craft pretty regularly. And I'm also interested in the interviewing, how you've grown as an interviewer, because not everyone is a natural interviewer. That can take some work too and a skill set. So if you could share with us everything you've learned about writing and what you're learning about interviewing as well, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Interviewing is a skill, and one that I'm becoming more aware of wanting to improve at. You know, early on, I didn't think enough about it and didn't realize how much of a skill that was to actually learn. But some of the surprises with interviewing authors, you know, everybody approaches writing so differently. And that's been one of the really freeing things of having so many conversations. I think when you go online and you start searching for, you know, I want to be a writer, or how do I publish a book, there tends to be this sort of stock advice that you're given. And some of it, I think for some people is probably the right advice, but it tends to be write to a word goal. You know, every day I'm going to write 500 or 1,000 words. And it tends to be, here's what the process is going to look like. And for some people, maybe that's the right path. For me, I found that a little bit, it didn't work. My writing tends to be more seasonal because of so many other responsibilities. I've got young kids, you know, I'm pastoring a church. It tends to be, can I carve out an afternoon, right? It's not sort of an everyday discipline. And so finding the freedom to sort of write the way that works in your lifestyle in this season or for your personality. You hear that when you interview a bunch of writers and talk about writing, is they all have a little different routines. And for some, the space they're writing in is important. And for others, it's not. And for some, it's about the outline. And for some, it's about just sort of self-expression on the page and then editing. And you can't go out looking for a system that you'll just sort of implement for yourself. You acquire bits and pieces and you try them and you build out that thing that works for you. The other piece that sort of you come away with from all these interviews is just how much good writing there is going on. So many of the writers that I've interviewed are people that, to be honest, without the podcast, I don't know if I would have ever stumbled across their books or heard their names, but yet you read and you realize just how much faithfulness and how much goodness is happening in those places. And I don't know, it gives me a sense of dignity for the work, that you don't have to sort of hit a bestsellers list or be a household name as an author for that work to have dignity. There's so many people alongside you doing it in small ways and humble ways, but yet are faithful and just really valuable. When it comes to interviewing, that's a hard one. I try not to interrupt people as much as I did in the beginning. So I've learned to pause in silence is a good thing. So that's one of the really practical ones. You know, I usually prepare a set of questions before interviews. One of the commitments I've made, which has sometimes been hard, is I try to have read whatever I'm talking to a person about. And so sometimes that's quick reading. You know, I don't get to spend as much time with books as I would like, but I really want to, you know, I want to respect the work they've done enough to not just sort of have a preset question sheet from a publicist. I really want to interact. And I really try to, I think so much of the interview comes down to the research you've put in ahead of time. You know, I want to ask, oftentimes we'll listen to other interviews they've done, and I'll want to ask questions that dig deeper into those answers, or I'll use those answers to form new questions. And at the end of the day, I'm trying to ask things that I want to know. You know, that's I don't want it to just be, hey, let's talk about the thing you wrote in the book, because that's what the book's there for. I want to encourage people to go read the book, and oftentimes that's through asking some of these bigger questions. And usually those questions I put together, I try to use as just a roadmap to a good conversation. You know, gives some peace of mind to them to know where we're going, and gives me something to fall back on. But hopefully it evolves into a conversation And then the other technical thing besides interruption, I look at the waveform, at the end, you'll have these two audio tracks and you can see how much time they talked. There should always be more of them talking than me talking. So that's always, if there's too much of me on the waveform, I know that was not a good interview.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good.
Very good. Chase, you used the word discipline, and you have talked about how an undisciplined soul leads to undisciplined writing. So Karen and I would love to hear, how have you disciplined your soul?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't want to put myself out as saying, look at how disciplined my writing is because I'm so disciplined. Mostly that comes from recognizing how undisciplined I am and sort of writing into that. I think a lot about wanting my writing to be true. And what that usually means is I am a slow writer. I think I will probably never have a post go viral for its controversy because I tend to write about things 3 or 4 months after they've happened, because I particularly do this when I write about movies. I tend to do this about Disney movies, oddly enough, because I have young kids and I'm so often thinking about what's in these movies they're watching. But the movie will come out and 4 months later I write an article about it and nobody cares at that point.
The new Aladdin movie was faster, wasn't it?
Maybe I might have hit that one in a few weeks. So yeah, I must have been really excited about that one or motivated. But I want to be careful and say, I can say, the terrifying thing about writing is I can say anything. But I can do it so quickly. Literally, we can hang up from this call and I can go to my blog, and in 20 minutes, I could have published something and shared it online. That terrifies me, to be honest with you, because I know just because I have an idea or think something does not mean it's true. I have a long track record of being able to prove that just because I had an idea, it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it beneficial. I love one of the guests I interviewed one time said, some thoughts should be books, some of those thoughts should be articles, and some of those articles should be tweets, and some of those tweets should just be kept to yourself. Just because we think it doesn't make it valuable. And so I tend to be slow in trying to process, is this something valuable to say? Number one. Number two, am I the right person to say it? Because it may be valuable to say, but honestly, somebody else it may just be more their thing and a better thing for them to say. And number three, have I integrated this into my life before I say it? I think this comes a lot from my background in preaching. You can preach an accurate sermon, right? That it handles the text correctly, that understands the point of the passage. And you can do that without having actually worked that into your own soul that week. And that can be hard coming week after week. But I often will gauge when I think I'm ready on a sermon by, has it impacted me personally? Sometimes has it made me change something about how I think or live? Oftentimes it's an emotion. Has this brought a sense of conviction to me personally? And I want that. It doesn't always happen, but as much as possible, I want that to happen before I preach a sermon. And I think about the same thing with writing. I want it to have been true in my life. Even if it's something I'm struggling with, I want to have felt it, not just had an idea or some sort of clever turn of phrase about it before I write it. And oftentimes what that means is I'll have big outlines for an article and I think it's there and the idea is interesting, but it just, for whatever reason, it doesn't feel like it's for me to say, or at least not at this time. And so there's some writing that I just never publish, articles I outline that just never finally come together because it just doesn't seem, number one, I'm not 100% convinced it's true. I'm not 100% convinced it's for me to say, and I want to be really careful with that.
Have you published something that you've regretted? Like, have you been sort of reckless? I can't imagine you being terribly reckless, and thought, oh, why did I say that?
Twice and luckily I caught it in editing. One of the big moments for me in recognizing this was when I was working on the first book manuscript. I took a sort of, like, sometimes I'll write sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of humorous things. I like sort of witty stuff. And so I sort of made a little jab pass at a celebrity. I was talking about a celebrity who said, at one point, I don't want to be your kid's role model. And I was writing about heroics and how they form kids. And I made a sort of joke about, well, who would want that person as your kid's role model anyway? And I remember very clearly reading it and thinking to myself, which is absurd to think, what if that celebrity ever read this thing that I'm writing? And I've made a point at their expense. And I remember thinking as a Christian, no matter how funny or witty or clever or right that point might actually be, like I've lost that reader and I've used them to make a point to another. And I don't know, it really convicted me and it made me, I drew a pretty hard line in the sand for me saying, I will disagree with people, but I will always do it in a thoughtful way and in a respectful way. And I never want to write at someone else's expense. If it's going to come at someone's expense, it should come at my expense. I'm the writer, not someone else's. And so I'm really thankful I didn't hit publish on that. Honestly, nobody would have ever known. That person would have absolutely never read that article, but it created in me a sort of discipline that I think someday could pay off, in that I just want to make sure that I pay the price for the writing, not someone else.
Yeah, I really like that. And you've also said that to write well comes from living well, or to write well is to live well. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, that flows a little bit out of early on when I started writing. I was a little concerned about if I was good enough. My background is in speaking. I'd always thought of myself as somebody who preaches, not somebody who writes. And I had a writing coach, Mick Silva, who I've done a couple of episodes with on the podcast, who said to me one time, "Good writing is good thinking." And it really freed me up, because I thought, okay, I can think. Like, that's something I've been doing. I oftentimes will think that writing comes down. I think it's, and I don't mean this to sound sort of presumptuous, but I think it's a taste issue. Can I look at a piece of writing and recognize if it's good or bad? What's wrong with it? And then the more difficult question, can I be objective enough to look at my own writing and recognize what's good and bad in that, right? Which is a whole nother task in and of itself. And so really it comes down to the objectivity of what I'm doing. Can I be objective about it? Can I be courageous enough to change what I'm doing and recognize? Can I think through, do I actually have something to say? And so to that degree, a lot of that flows back to, if I'm living a dull life with dull thoughts and I'm just sort of capturing whatever surface level idea at the moment is happening in culture, I'm not reading that stuff, right? Like, and I ask myself that question a lot. Like, would I read this thing that I'm writing? Would I be interested in what I'm saying? And if the answer is no, then why in the world am I writing it? And if I don't have something, like, I never want to write because I've got to write. I've got to get something out. Like, it should flow from something that I've thought about, something that I feel strongly about. Eugene Peterson, who's one of my favorite writers, probably the favorite writer, and I joke on the podcast about ringing a bell, which lately, if you've been listening, it's been all of my guests who are mentioning his name, not me. So I'm not held responsible for that. He one time, later in retirement, was talking, he tells this story about talking with his wife about how he hadn't been writing recently. And he said, "I just can't figure out why I'm not interested in writing." And she said, "Well, it's because you're retired and you're not angry about anything anymore." And it was kind of, she was joking with him. But the point was, he had sort of been in retirement at his lake, and everything was sort of in its place. And that sort of passion, energy that I have to say something about this just didn't exist. And that's what was keeping him from writing. I think that's a little bit to the question, right? When you're out there in the middle of it, when you know your own pain and you see people's pain and you know what's going on in life, how does it not sort of well up in you at the right time, the right thing to want to say, right? To want to be a part of it. That's where most of the writing comes from for me.
Chase, one final one of your thoughts that we really wanted to probe a little bit with you, and that was that you've said that writing requires a borderline lethal dose of ego.
Did I say that? That sounds like something I might, yeah. Yeah.
So our question is, how does a Christian live with that?
I feel this. The reason I would say that is because I feel that acutely all the time. I oftentimes will say, I'm feeling that really in this season, as we're sort of in our stay-at-home orders. I'm not sure what policies you guys are under, but it's been, this Sunday will be my 5th week preaching to a camera. And it's very bizarre because I then turn around and edit it. And then I'm doing the podcast and I'm writing. And I will sometimes say to my wife, I'm so tired of hearing myself talk. Like, I'm bored out of myself. I'm uninterested in my own ideas anymore. I feel it because there are times where, you're so in your head and everything's about what you're thinking and what you're outlining, what you're saying in this platform, that it borderlines on just losing my perspective, that at the end of the day, if today was my last day, the world would go on, right? And other people would say intelligent things and other people would make contributions. So it's hard. It's hard to be, the act of writing, it is solitary. It is about you. It is about how you are connecting thoughts, and you have to do that. There's no way out of that, right? It doesn't connect itself. Like, you have to do that work, and it should flow out of who you are. But I think you have to constantly find, the right way for me is I find myself walking away. I have to be able to stop at some point. Because if I just obsess with it too much, that ego becomes all consuming. So Sabbath has been a huge, huge practice. In fact, Sundays when I'm done recording into the camera lens, our strange new habit has been to go on a walk as a family. And part of that is just putting it down. I don't need to see who's commenting online or likes, or I have to walk away from it. I have to have hobbies outside of writing. I have to realize that the world exists and goes on besides just this thing I'm trying to accomplish. And then at times you have to shut the door and sit down, and you have to do the work. You have to think and articulate and write and walk away from the edge, whenever you need to get away from it. So much of it is about just knowing yourself and knowing when you're working out of that desperation and when you're working out of faithfulness. And sometimes those can be really hard differences to decipher.
So Chase, what can we look forward to in the podcast in the months to come? Can you give us some hints about what's coming up? And also for people who may not be familiar with the podcast, where can they find you and where are you online?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I've got some really good conversations, some interviews coming up. I have a couple of monologues planned. As I've sort of mentioned to you offline, I'm really close on some publishing news. So hopefully in the next few weeks that I'll be able to make some of that official, which will be a long time coming, and I'm looking forward to. And so probably, I'm looking at a new book project over the next 12 months, and I may, do some monologues about how that process is going as well too, and what that's looking like. So I'm excited about that. And as I mentioned before, you will never have to type Replogle to find any of my information. Pastor Writer, so pastorwriter.com is a great place to listen to podcasts. It's anywhere you do listen to podcasts, iTunes or Spotify, you can find it there. And I love connecting with people, so Twitter is a great way to do that. The Pastor Writer on Twitter, or you can email me through the site as well. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk to people and hear what they're working on and talk about writing. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So it's I love being able to do this and be able to talk about a shared interest that we all have. And no, I see you shaking your head sometimes when I talk about how hard it is, which is enough encouragement for me too, right? I'm not the only one. So yeah, thanks for the work you're doing and giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chase. I mean, I was struck as you were speaking, and when I listened to your podcast, just how important it is to be part of a community of writers. And, Patricia and I are that to each other, but of course it goes much beyond that. And just that generosity, even that your podcast demonstrates by shining the light on other people and drawing out their wisdom, is so valuable to our whole community.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's been one of the big lessons for me too, is again, we've talked about how isolating writing can be, but how important relationships are in that process as well too. So whether they're these kind, conversations you get to listen in on or have, or people you're writing with or reading to, yeah, those relationships are an important thing to steward in that process of writing.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I guess we'll wrap, Patricia?
Yeah, sounds good. Chase, thank you. God bless you and your family. And Karen and I will continue to listen.
Yes,
I appreciate
indeed.
it. And I covet your prayers as well, too. So and thanks for the work you guys are doing. Honored to be a part of it.
Yeah,
Thanks
no,
so
it's
much.
great. And we're going to do this again sometime. So watch for more of these interviews, and you can find us at craftcostcall.com and on Facebook as well.